Thank you, Izzy. Before Kelly helps us peer behind the endowment curtain, I just want to say a few words about how we got here. Kelly and I and other alumni first came together last year to join students and union workers to try to prevent the outsourcing of more than 100 jobs. And as you know, we did not succeed. But we were able to raise about $170,000, which we distributed to the workers who were not rehired by AVI to provide some financial cushion for them. And what we heard over and over again from workers and from the alumni who donated was that this is not an Oberlin that they recognized. Instead of upholding its historic mission for justice, Oberlin deepened inequality. Instead of protecting the campus community, Oberlin jettisoned decades of loyalty and experience. That was not the Oberlin that we recognized. The austerity drive by the administration trustees has affected everyone, obviously. Students' costs keep rising. Resources like disability services have suffered. I've been hearing about the horrors of the dining system. Faculty and staff have had their pay and benefits frozen and cut. Workloads are up. The co-ops are under attack. But in outsourcing the dining and custodial jobs, Oberlin leveled the heaviest blow on those who could least afford it in a town that cannot afford it. The poverty rate in Lorain County is almost 14%, and in Oberlin is 28%. When good family-supporting jobs disappear, they're very hard to replace. On the one hand, Oberlin's decision wasn't unusual. The insistence on austerity is part of a national trend, as is the leveling those blows that deepen inequality. It's the same thing we see from other billion-dollar corporations that are entangled with Wall Street. But Oberlin needs to be more than that. And I want to see Oberlin stay true to its progressive nature and tradition. I want it to be the Oberlin that I can recognize. For that to happen, all of us will need to continue to stand up to the administration and trustees when they choose to bow to Wall Street's priorities. And they do, over and over again, and Kelly's going to detail that for you. And before I turn it over to her, I just want to tell you about one other project that we have, which is that we sponsor summer internships, paid summer internships, with labor and workers' rights organizations. I'll have a list you can sign up on afterwards if you want more information, and we'll also share that information through Slack and the Career Center if you're interested in those things. And now I'll give you Kelly.
Am I allowed to take off the mask, or I can do it either way, whatever. I can keep it on.
Take off masks if you're, I think it's like 10 feet away or something.
Okay, it's a little bit heavy, but thanks so much. Thanks to all the members of Slack for inviting us here. It's a real honor, and this has been quite a number of months in the making, so thank you all very much. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be back at Oberlin and to help you understand what's been going on with Oberlin's endowment, which is the billion-dollar question. So, on March 17th of this year, the Oberlin Review published an article stating that Oberlin's endowment had surpassed $1 billion for the first time in its history. A year before, just before the pandemic started, Oberlin announced its intention to cut or outsource over 100 union jobs in order to save $2.5 million per year. Despite opposition from students, faculty, staff, alumni, and community members, and the fact that depriving people of work and benefits in the midst of a deadly pandemic is simply cruel, the college went ahead with its plans to fire or outsource dining and custodial workers, never even managing to bargain in good faith with the union, according to politics professor Kris. Faculty salaries were frozen and pension contributions halted. Then, the Oberlin began gutting the co-ops, and I understand negotiating a health care plan that provides fewer benefits at greater employee cost. How do we begin to understand the distance between Oberlin's evident prosperity on the one hand, billion-dollar endowment, and imposed austerity on the other? This is the fundamental kind of paradox where we start in trying to figure out what's going on. Why would an institution with over $1 billion at its disposal act in defiance of its progressive legacy and engage in union busting to save a mere $2.5 million per year, which is far less than it evidently pays in investment management fees each year? A point I'll come back to later. Why didn't the extreme conditions of the still ongoing pandemic inspire kindness and compassion within Oberlin's leadership rather than a cold-hearted budget logic, targeting some of its most vulnerable workers and unique institutions? What broke at Oberlin? Financialization. This is one of the things that contributed to what has happened, the dynamic of what's going on now at Oberlin. The extreme wealth on one hand, and the imposition of various austerity measures on the other. The language of finance can be both abstract and arcane, and difficult for outsiders to understand. And that's partly just a function of professional specialization and complexity, but it can also serve to obscure what is really going on with the money, especially for those not privy to, say, the private contracts that govern most of Oberlin's investments, which is pretty much all of us in this room. Informational disparities are key to the way financialization functions. Big banks, financiers, and ratings agencies all have access to information that the average person, even a very smart and inquisitive person, simply does not. Much of that information is algorithmically driven and tied to big data and used to predict things like future performance, likelihood of default, and so on. Similarly, the trustees' investment committee has information that it won't disclose, like what it actually pays in fees to Wall Street, which means that other stakeholders do not, and indeed cannot, know what's going on with the money. Trust is needed to maintain a sense that all stakeholders are on the same side, that there is indeed one Oberlin. But trust can break down when decisions get made that negatively affect the quality of one's own life or that of others we care about, which is what austerity inevitably does. And I want to say about financialization too, this is a fairly recent process. I would say it got accelerated in the 1970s, and it's been ongoing ever since. In the world of finance, it kind of functions as a state of nature, but it's not. It's a series of decisions, it's the result of a series of decisions, and it can be otherwise. So the budget logic is not like just what is natural. And when you put a number to a figure, people think that like the endowment is kind of like a checkbook. Like when you put a number to it, it makes it look like it has an actual existence. And what I'm going to explain in what follows is how that's not exactly true, and it's a lot more complicated. So, one of the key concepts of this kind of financialized economy that we all live in right now, and it's not just at Oberlin, it's pretty much everywhere, is the notion of shareholder value. It's a term you've probably run across, and it's a key concept within what is generally called neoliberalism, which grew out of the free market approach of the so-called Chicago School. Any government control of markets was anathema to this group. Instead, it was the market that would be the controlling force, and free markets were therefore the highest good. Let's consider Milton Friedman's views on shareholder value. I'll take a minute to read this. Now, making profits is, in this view, the highest good, and the only obligation of management here in a business is to make as much money as possible. This is one of the main intellectual roots of austerity logic, in which monetary value exceeds all other concepts of value. The logic of the bottom line. And just call attention to the fact that he calls the idea that you would think that anything other than profit and budget logic was important. He views this as a fundamentally subversive doctrine. And you think about climate change and all the things that are going on right now and the notion of social responsibilities that we have, none of that matters. The highest good is to increase profits. But is it really true, that view? Especially as we confront accelerating climate change, for example, don't we need a more expansive concept of value? This is where stakeholder values come in. And at Oberlin, students and employees of the college are all stakeholders, as is the surrounding town and county, because the college is a big employer. Students are not merely consumers of educational product under this view, but people who have a stake in the Oberlin community as a whole. Because of course, there are other concepts of value beside the monetary. So in what follows, I will raise a series of questions about what's going on with the money at Oberlin, which I hope may shed some light on the college's recent actions. First, I will explain some basic features of the investments in Oberlin's endowment and how they have been managed. Then, I will take up the issue of bonds, debt, and credit ratings. Both aspects are key to solving the riddle of how a college whose endowment has evidently reached a record high is nevertheless imposing numerous austerity measures. I'm really proud of this slide. It's the Yale Model. So the Yale Model, what is it? University and college endowments, as big institutional investors like pension funds and national sovereign funds, play an important role in sustaining our country's increasingly high income inequalities and funneling ever more resources into Wall Street. I think the figure for the first pandemic year was that top 15 hedge fund managers altogether made $32 billion. That's 15 people. So many colleges and universities now follow the pattern set by David Swensen at Yale. The so-called Yale Model, which is all about heavy allocations to alternative asset classes like hedge funds, private equity, venture capital, real estate investment trusts, and the like. So what are Oberlin's allocations? As you can see, Oberlin is pretty heavily into these alternative investments. These are based on target percentages listed in the current investment policy. They can fluctuate a little bit, but that's the basic breakdown. So around 2/3 of Oberlin's endowment is currently in alternative investments, and that's an extraordinarily high percentage. It follows the Yale model. I mean, they have very high asset allocations in these and alternatives as well. But it's a high percentage. And to put some perspective on that, there was a member of the California State Employees Pension Fund who basically got booted off the board because she thought that an 8% allocation in alternatives was too risky for retirees' money. So Oberlin has 64%, more or less, right now. The move into such asset classes has been driven by yield chasing, getting higher returns that would evidently be possible with stocks, bonds, and other more regulated exchange-traded investments. That's pretty much the main justification for heavy allocations into alternatives, that they're worth it, they're expensive, sure, but they make more money. So what are alternatives? In sum, they're a class of investments that circulate in largely unregulated private markets and are not publicly traded on the stock exchange. They are risky, illiquid, difficult to value, and also very expensive. Although alternatives existed for some time, they took off in the 90s with the implementation of the Yale model, and in fact, that's when you started seeing this pattern at Oberlin. It was soon after the 90s, even though Swensen warned others not to try this at home. I mean, he's the manager of the Yale Fund, right? They have lots of money. He had really good contacts. And this is not something that every institution has by a long shot. So I'll run through some of the prominent features, asking a few questions along the way about transparency to help identify what's going on with the money. First feature is that they're pretty opaque. They're largely unregulated. The contracts that govern them are private. A few have been leaked, but basically you have no idea what the terms are of these investments. As outsiders, we're not able to see what's being invested in, because these things have like a name for the fund, but that doesn't say anything about the underlying investments at all. You don't know what the terms and conditions and the fees and expenses are. It's all in the contract and it's all private. There could be conflicts of interest or self-dealing, but it's all very hard to say because there's no transparency. So as far as I can tell, only the trustee investment committee knows what's going on with the alternatives. And despite being asked, they have refused to provide a full picture of the total cost of these investments, all fees and costs, or their actual rates of return. Question 1. What is Oberlin invested in? Given what I've just said, it's very hard to tell. Is Oberlin invested in fossil fuels, for-profit prisons, understaffed nursing homes, exploitative rental properties, distressed consumer debt, and the like? Because the alternative investments are governed by private contracts, there's only one sure way for us to know. Oberlin must open up its books and agree to an independent audit. You can get some information about Oberlin's investments, and this is from Form 900T. If you can't find it on ProPublica, you can get it directly through the IRS. This is where limited partnerships are listed. Alternative investments are formed by partnership contracts, the private contracts I was talking about. And here's a list from 2010, soon after the financial crisis, when Oberlin, like countless other colleges and universities, was clearly experiencing some financial trouble. With some digging, you might be able to find out a little bit more about these vehicles and possibly some information about their specific investments, or at least which investment firms created the funds, and what types of industries they typically invest in, and what kind of reputation they have. The financial press can be a good source of information on those things, but that's not enough. If Oberlin has nothing to hide, it should be willing to open up its books and be transparent about its investments and its financial condition. I chose this slide because it's from 2010, so it does indicate, there was a big loss on these investments. You can say that much. But also because the disclosures change, and if I wanted to put up the most recent one, it would be like 5 pages. But it's where you would get information about those specific vehicles. So question 2. Have there been conflicts of interest or self-dealing? Also difficult to uncover are possible conflicts of interest and self-dealing. The world of alternative investments is a small, pretty clubby one, and I'm sure there are profits and prestige points to be made from scratching various backs through various investments. And that's not to say that there's anything illegal going on, just that it's very much an insider's world, and outsiders can't easily determine if favors are being done or not. Here's another bit of information from the college's 990s that raises some questions. Between 2009, so right during the crisis, and 2017, more than $189 million from the endowment was invested with 2 companies owned by the trustees. It is not illegal for the college to put money into trustee-controlled alternatives. That's why there's a space on the tax form where such things have to be declared. But as a fellow alum put it, it's not a good look. Presumably, some arrangements may have been made with those trustees regarding any profits they stood to make, because that's the standard arrangement. We do know that one of them funded a fellowship and that the other has his name on the new jazz building. So maybe they put the money they earned back into the college, right? But we don't know. We don't know the details, and that's another reason that Oberlin needs to open up its books. Another aspect of these investments is that they're very illiquid. Private equity investments in particular can have terms of about 5 to 12 years. Oberlin had one real estate investment that lost over $6.8 million between 2008 and 2019 out of an apparent initial investment of $11.5 million. So it lost over half of what it invested. Disclosures were different before the 2008 crisis. Real estate had to be declared in a separate form. So I was actually able to determine the amount of the initial investment in that vehicle, as best I can tell. That information is no longer available. They don't require that disclosure, which is funny given how much the crisis was involving real estate. So generally speaking, as part of the problem of liquidity, if you wanted to get out of these vehicles, like say you saw, oh, my real estate investment is losing over 50%, you have a problem. You confront a difficulty because a lot of these, because they're governed by contract, have very expensive exit fees. So many holders of these things, and this was a systemic problem, found that it would probably be cheaper just to hold on to the stuff than it would be to pay the probably tens of millions or more that it would have taken to exit the contracts. And, you know, the other problem with them is that if they are losing value, like the one I just mentioned, there's not going to be a buyer for them anyway. It's a very illiquid market. They're also difficult to value. No observable market activity means no direct evidence for price. So prices are generally modeled algorithmically. So you have inputs, and your price is only going to be as good as the accuracy of your inputs. And in audit documents, like in the financial statements of the college, when they get audited, they usually say something like, well, the auditor thinks this is all very well and good, but circumstances could change. And they do. The financial crisis happened. That was a big change of circumstance, and that caused enormous ripple effects throughout the whole economy. So the fact that they're algorithmically driven, they have to be, there's no direct evidence of price, but it can also introduce a kind of instability based on the predictive inputs that you're building into your algorithm. And then there's Facebook, and you all know what's happening with their algorithms. So, auditors don't often adequately test management's prices, so the college's prices for their investments. And because price information is often resold by different vendors, and you don't necessarily know it's coming from the same ultimate source, it's not unheard of for auditors to test price values using the same original source of information, which is no test at all. In some, it can be very difficult to say how much these things are really worth. This means we don't know, really, if the endowment is actually worth over $1 billion. This raises another question. What are the actual returns on Oberlin's investments? How much money has the endowment actually made? Given the heavy investments in alternatives, the appeal of which has clearly been driven by yield chasing, did Oberlin invest wisely? We don't know because the trustees have been asked, and asked specifically what the returns are net of fees, and no information has been forthcoming. This is a graphic from Kris, which seems to show that the endowment is doing just fine and everything's going as it should be. He's used this graphic in support of the college's investment decisions, keeping in mind that valuation is a tricky business and that we don't and can't know what the blue line is really based on. There's a lot of complexities in the way this information is being presented, and a lot of questions you would want to ask to be able to evaluate it. So leaving aside the fact that Oberlin started investing in alternatives before 2000, which is his starting point, it initially looks like a triumph for the top blue line, right? But consider the relationship between the post-2008 crisis numbers and the ones for 2020. So the numbers, the first set of numbers there, and then the last ones. What they show is not exactly the triumph of the blue line. Rather, the numbers indicate that a 70-30 portfolio increased by 40%, comparing with two numbers, right? While the endowment increased by 75%, and the S&P 500 increased by 104%, which is a much higher figure. This suggests that the yield-chasing strategy, at least for the past decade, so post-crisis, has not panned out. But again, there's no way for outsiders to know whether Oberlin's investment strategies under various trustees since 2008, because there's been a lot of them, have been successful. Only open books and independent forensic audit will allow stakeholders to see and judge for themselves. Another feature is that these investments are very expensive. Above all, they are very expensive. All we can know with certainty about what Oberlin has paid in fees comes from its 990 forms. But according to Ludovic Philippou, who's a leading private equity expert at Oxford, these investments can cost as much as 5 times or more the amount listed on an institution's 990 form, because so many costs and fees remain hidden and undisclosed. They're governed by private contracts. And research has shown that the returns on both hedge funds and private equity are, after fees, about equivalent to or even less than other far less costly investments. Which brings us to question 4. How much has Oberlin paid out in fees and costs for its alternatives? The answer is we simply don't know. We'd need an independent audit to provide this information. And again, the trustees have been asked, but they haven't been willing to say how much Oberlin is actually paying. And I'd be happy to be proven wrong on this, that Oberlin isn't, say, paying out $10 to $15 million a year in fees to Wall Street. But without opening the books, and without an audit, without honesty from the part of the trustees, instead of avoidance of the question, we just don't know. And that money is important when you consider that the college was going to save about $2.5 million and is imposing, by outsourcing the workers, and is imposing all these other austerity measures. Here's another bit of information from the 990s. This is the most recent available one. Oberlin has typically reported fees of about $3 million or so a year. They're lower this year. And Canavan admitted that the college actually pays more because, as he put it, you have to pay for talent. If Oberlin is paying anywhere near $15 million a year, or even $10 million a year, this makes all the austerity measures and the $2.5 million saved by firing and outsourcing union workers even more horrible. All that fee money goes directly to Wall Street, and such fees are often justified by performance. But again, it looks like Oberlin's endowment has underperformed the S&P 500 in the period since the crisis. Public market investments can be made at minimal cost, unlike alternatives, which drain away many millions in various costs and fees each year. And here are some of the social costs of alternatives. Because again, it's shareholder value that rules the day. Now, people in the industry will say various things about the measures that they impose on the companies that they take private. And often they'll say, well, we can bring a small business up to scale. And that indeed does happen. I mean, so it's, to give you a little bit more of a nuanced picture, but, by and large, the effects have been very poor because of the way shareholder value dominates the mindset of the finance community. So what we've seen, and job losses, imagine some of these things will be familiar to you here at Oberlin: imposed austerity, acceleration of work, and decline of conditions of work, declines in service quality, because this is budget logic, right? They're trying to squeeze every little bit out of a company. Bankruptcies and losses of pensions, sometimes that's quite deliberate because there's a pension benefit guarantee corporation that these companies know will pick up some of the things that they're offloading, and they offload them on taxpayers. It's not that much different from the bailouts when the big banks got bailed out with taxpayer money. So it's very destructive kind of things. They're not interested in permanence, they're not interested in community, they're not interested in stakeholder values, they're just interested in making money. And these are some of the costs of maintaining this highly financialized ecosystem. Again, not just at Oberlin. The costs are generally not borne by the alternatives industry, which is very, very wealthy, but by the rest of us. They gut businesses, they destroy jobs, they offload pension obligations, and they do so without any consequence. And that's because there's a widespread and highly ideological commitment to increasing efficiency and maximizing shareholder value at the expense of whatever values stakeholders may hold important. And we all have a lot of other values than making money. That extracted shareholder value has to come from somewhere, and increasingly it comes at the expense of other values, like fair wages, decent work conditions, leisure time, affordable health and childcare, and affordable educations. To underscore my point, this is the cover of Prequin's predictions for alternatives. They're very happy about how the industry is doing, and they project that the industry will grow by several trillions of dollars over the next number of years. So, you know, enormous wealth in rocket ships. It's not the first time we've seen this pattern. And yeah, they're very happy about what they do. So, now I come to the next part of the financialization equation, and that has to do with Oberlin's bonds. And this is another part of the
Can you speak more into the microphone?
Oh, sorry. Sorry. So another part of the puzzle to consider before we can identify what went wrong at Oberlin, and that has to do with Oberlin's debts. Here's a list of bonds that the college has taken out since 1970. There are others too that aren't on this list, including one from 2019, and also the so-called green bond and a refunding bond that was issued along with it from this past summer. So the basic pattern is one of accelerated borrowing, which is part of increasing financialization. You can first see it in the 80s. As then President Starr was a big builder. That was when I was here. Then it slows down again in the 90s before accelerating again. You know, in the 70s, they had just had one, right? Got them through quite a long time. And it's not that this is a bad thing to do. It's just that the accelerating pace of it raises some questions. Debt in the form of bonds is one way the colleges finances big capital expenditures like new buildings and projects of the sort quite visible on campus these days. And given fluctuating interest rates, some bonds are also used to refinance higher cost debt. So if the environment changes with the rates, you want to renegotiate so you can borrow at a lower cost. That makes sense. But the trouble came with the interest rate swaps. And the college, like so many other colleges and universities, and like so many school districts, municipalities, utilities, and so on, invested in a thing called an interest rate swap before the 2008 financial crisis. Different kinds of entities can borrow at different interest rates and under different conditions. And a swap allows counterparties to exchange, say, a variable interest rate for a favorable fixed one, which can help make payments and expenses more predictable. Oberlin has had several such interest rate swaps. When the crash hit and interest rates went down to near zero, however, the swaps caused institutions holding them to bleed cash since they were stuck paying a higher fixed interest rate. And these agreements also governed by long-term contracts that are expensive to exit. Harvard evidently paid $1 billion to get out of swaps that its former president, Larry Summer, had signed off on. The next slide is a graph that illustrates the dynamic with the swaps. And this is from the Roosevelt Institution's important 2016 report on swaps in higher ed, which if you've not taken a look at, I would highly recommend. It's amazing work, because they were aware that this was going on, and they were one of the early studies chronicling the effects of it. This shows what happened at Michigan State. So Michigan State was paying out interest rates of over 4%, the dotted red line, and was receiving far less from the bank it swapped with, the solid blue line. You can see how it basically bottoms out. The pattern was repeated over and over again all across the country, and again, not just at colleges and universities. All across the country, holders of swaps were paying out more than they were receiving in return. Schools and libraries closed, municipal services declined, and of course, tuitions were raised as well. One of the most egregious examples that I've run across, and there are many, because this happened all over the country, was the Chicago public school system, which had an interest rate swap. And one of the things that made it so horrible was that Bank of America, who had signed the contract with, its own internal research was showing growing risks with entering into these swaps, right? So you shouldn't have been selling them if you knew there were risks, if you weren't disclosing them. But the people who got the contract signed received a bonus, so there was an incentive to get everybody into these swaps. And these are our towns, our school districts, our water districts. Chicago Public School District is around 90% minority. And they lost over $40 million because of their swaption, which is just horrific. I lived in Chicago, and the effects on that district were profound. So, how much did Oberlin lose? I'm still investigating this. I hope to have an actual number. But if any of the other schools that the Roosevelt Institute portrayed in its study are any indication, Oberlin lost many, many millions. That Roosevelt Institute study, which examined swaps at 19 schools, so really a fraction of the ones who were holding them. When I started doing this research, I didn't even know whether Oberlin had swaps, but it did. But for the 19 schools that they examined, they calculated that altogether the institutions collectively lost $2.7 billion. That's 19 schools. Money that could have covered tuition and fees for 108,000 students at those schools. So Oberlin's administration and trustees should know the answer to this question, though so far as I know, they haven't provided one. But they have been busy trying to get additional lower cost bonds to either refund or redeem this expensive debt. I would say that's been a major activity of trying to stem the bleeding over the past decade. When you deal with debt these days, you also deal with the credit rating agencies, which have become very powerful. The ratings given by these agencies affect how much an institution can borrow and at what interest rate. In the years after the 2008 crisis, Moody's, which is one of the largest ratings agencies and is kind of the high-class rating agency in higher ed, first downgraded Oberlin's then AA2 rating to negative. This is after the crisis. It downgraded it again then to AA3, outlook negative. These are still investment grade issues, right? And they're investment grade ratings. But if Oberlin got downgraded again, its debt would be in a more speculative B grade investment territory. And it would risk having to post collateral, which is not good. It means that people don't really trust you. The ratings agencies have become really, really powerful. And the funny thing is, they don't really consider all that much that any of us would consider important about the quality of Oberlin, the kind of education it offers, the things that we all value about it. Here's Kris's wonderful graph illustrating Moody's Higher Ed scorecard. So most of it is about, creditworthiness. Can the institution sustain itself? And that's an important thing. I'm not saying that, yes, things should be sustained in a responsible way. But this is all very abstract, apart from the matter of debts and assets and revenues. So here again, we come to the questions of value and the prioritization of financial values above all others. Oberlin might as well be Liberty University for all it matters to Moody's. And their debt is rated the same. Liberty is considered to have a strong brand, appealing to evangelical Christians. Oberlin also has a strong brand, but a different consumer base. Everything that makes Oberlin Oberlin is shoved down into that little box at the bottom. So let's take a look at what prompted the ratings change. It raised it just recently. This was after Canavan's announcement that the endowment had gone over $1 billion. The raise followed, I think, maybe a week or two after. It's all kind of, financial jargony and abstract, but it's the thing that emerges for me, and I'd be curious to hear if it looks the same to all of you, is Moody's seems to like what's happening at Oberlin. It likes all of these austerity measures. It likes union busting, halting faculty pension contributions, and gutting the co-ops. From this, I would say that Moody's thinks that they were very good things to do. And there's the issue of labor. In 2017 and 2019 bonds, and these are publicly available too. If any of you are interested, let me know and I can point you to them. So when I was reading over the 2019 bond issue, which is an investor-facing document, is pretty frank about the college's financial condition, what risks might affect revenues, I discovered something kind of interesting. The bond issue is dated July 24th, 2019, so before the job cuts were announced. But it seems they may have already been in the pipeline, because strikes and other labor actions are identified as a risk factor, admittedly one among many, in the college's ability to honor its debts. The language also appears in the 2017 issuance, but it does not appear in the 2013. So, in a sense, it's legal boilerplate. They're just trying to, but this is a new risk that's been identified, and this I would also tie to financialization. Labor is a risk. It's kind of a bad thing. You don't want these things interfering with your profits. So question 6 is, how and why did strikes and labor actions become a risk to be managed? And did this risk get managed by cuts and outsourcing? We don't know. We don't know how that language got in there. And it would be very interesting to hear from the trustees and the administration how exactly labor issues became a risk, especially in light of the union busting that came soon after this. So here's a recap of all the answers it would be nice to have to really understand what's going on with the college and the money and the imposition of austerity when the announcement was just made earlier this year of an over $1 billion endowment, which is a huge pile of money. So what has Oberlin invested in? Have there been conflicts of interest or self-dealing? What are the actual returns of Oberlin's investments? How much has Oberlin paid out in fees and costs for its alternatives? How much has Oberlin lost because of interest rate swaps? And why and when did labor become a risk to be managed? With answers to these questions, and we don't have any of them really, we would all have a much better sense of the financial condition of the college. Instead, what I've observed, since I got involved with, Kris and the others at the Just Transition Fund, is that there's been a kind of stonewalling. And maybe we're like meddling alums and we're annoying and they don't want to talk to us and we have no right to have this information. But what's happened is that the people who do possess this information, in my experience, they tend to behave in increasingly autocratic and unaccountable ways. in very undemocratic ways. And withholding information is one of the ways that they maintain that power. And the power to impose austerity, for example, which they seem very intent on doing. So again, we call to open up the books. The administration and the trustees could answer all of those questions if they wanted to. And so far they haven't, and that silence does not inspire trust. Without verifiable answers to these questions, no one is in a position to know what has been going on with the money, which is, after all, the motivating force behind all the disciplining and damaging austerity measures. To justify the sacrifices that have demanded of Oberlin students and employees, and before they demand more, which they most assuredly will, the administration and trustees owe you, Oberlin stakeholders, an independent audit. Thank you.